Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. I'm with David Frank. My name is Eric Kirk. We are talking national political news of the day. And I mean, where else do we start by last night's debate? But a lot has happened since last week that is also relevant. So we're going to dedicate two segments to the debate and the status of the race as it stands. So before going into the debate, we saw that Dick and Liz Cheney both endorsed the Kamala Harris. Alan Dershowitz left the Democratic Party. All kinds of news that way. Polls all over the place. The CNN New York Times poll. It's hard to refer to it as an outlier because it's like the gold star, right? On the other hand, it's much different from all the other polls. It shows Trump slightly ahead, although statistically a tie, in the on the national level, but it's the only one. So it's just so we don't know exactly where it is, and of course, all of the polls that have been taken, even the ones released today, are pre-debate. The debate happened last night. By most accounts, it was kind of a slaughter. Kamala Harris, I mean, Josh Marshall said that he's never seen Trump dominated this much in a debate. I mean, I was really impressed from the get-go when she went up and forced the handshake on him and introduced herself. I'm Kamala Harris because they never met. A little bit of comedy there. She started off a little nervous, but then her strategy was to needle him. They'd been telegraphing the strategy for weeks. I just assumed that Trump's people had prepared him to not take the bait. He took the debate every single time. It was actually I was actually starting to feel bad for him, and I don't support him. So it just but the key existential moment, if there was any, was where she needled him on his rally sizes. He would not respond to the question that the moderators asked him, and instead said he had to respond that his are the biggest and greatest rallies ever in politics. And then he went off on a side rant about the immigrants in Ohio. They're eating your dogs, they're eating your cats, they're eating your pets, and it got fact checked on that. There's some complaints that ABC only fact checked Trump, did it twice, and didn't fact check Kamala Harris any. Kamala Harris's camp is complaining that the moderators let Trump roll over him roll over them when they tried to get a question in, and he said, "I'm saying what I want." But the one time that Harris tried to do it, her microphone was cut off. They said, "No, you can't do that." So it was just so both sides weren't totally happy with the moderators. I was actually fine with them. I thought they did a good job. But everybody has to angle for that. When you're on the battle. So much to discuss about the debate and the state of the race. But Dave, I'm going to hand it over to you. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just say, 30,000-foot view. David Muir and Lindsey Davis, they're both considered widely respected. I guess with the exception of some of the attempts ahead of time to just discredit the network itself. And try to get ahead, what's the word? Skew the refs in your favor a little bit. There was some
play the ref.
Play the ref. There you go.
Yeah.
So maybe they wouldn't interrupt as much. Maybe they wouldn't fact check as much, or maybe they would be a little bit more, a little bit less strict on the silencing of the microphones of the people whose turn, wasn't their turn with the mic. But in fact, they actually were a little bit loosey-goosey on the microphone. I talked to a few different people about it, and it sounds like it was just a question of good television, where they were generally staying in their lane and their time. They generally weren't interrupting each other. So when they wanted to kind of go back and forth beyond what the questioning was, the moderators were steering the questions towards, they kind of let it happen. It's just that Trump always had to get the last word. And so I could see from a Harris perspective, she wasn't taking the opportunity to say yeah, but, and so in a sense, she kind of let Trump be his own worst enemy. If
Yes.
the person that you're debating against is digging and digging and digging and causing them harm, causing themselves harm by saying things that are a little bit unhinged or off topic or reflective of some sort of cognitive decline or an inability to exhibit self-control, as he was, that she probably just decided to let him kind of run with it. So maybe second guessing the moderators afterwards was a way to just to kind of say, hey, by the way, you let him do it, not me. So that was a little bit less of an issue. So generally speaking, I think the event went off well. It's as you said, the consensus is that Harris had a strong performance and that Trump had a weak performance. I think that under the surface, her goals of increasing familiarity with her and her policies and evidence of her presidential stature,
Yes.
she accomplished that and more. And in part, it was almost like Jedi mind power. It was not, of course, magic, but the techniques, which we'll talk about, but the techniques were an effective assertion of control of the narrative of the conversation.
Yep.
So she really was successful at presenting herself as a viable alternative. She did miss the opportunity a little bit to share some policy specifics. As you said in that first answer, she kind of had some specifics, even though they said yes, no, is the country in a better place? And then she kind of
Right.
went off. She had an canned speech prepared. So there was a criticism that she didn't have a lot of details and that there was a lot of rehearsed responses. But I think all in all, I mean, A+ on her side. And for Trump's side, real quickly, he was called out by fact checkers. I heard people after the debate say that there were over 50 times where he basically flat out fabricated things
Yeah.
that he was talking about. So the fact checkers were about a dozen, half a dozen to a dozen times where they actually were like, look, this is what is what. So
Right.
again, the Trump people didn't love that, but most importantly, like I said, he was clearly uncomfortable in the face of that criticism. He's wandering tirades veered into conspiracy. Definitely should have stayed on topic. I think he missed the opportunity to attack Harris's weaknesses. Instead of rebutting and taking the bait every time she laid a trap for him, if he stayed on topic, he would have done a better job. So we could talk more about some of that, but that's my general impressions.
Sure. I mean, Lindsey Graham afterwards was overheard in the spin room saying he needs to fire his debate preppers. Well, that would be Tulsi Gabbard for one, and a number of them. But Republicans, other than Marco Rubio trying to argue that Trump actually won it, there weren't many advocates outside of his campaign actually saying that he won. He wandered into the spin room. Whoever had that idea definitely ought to be fired afterwards, and started answering questions that were thrown at him by a mob of reporters. And he started talking about polls that showed he won 90-20, 80-6. And what the polls he must be talking about are the ones that some online media put on for you to choose, for you to vote one way or another. Totally no science to it, because what happens is they get freeped, which is basically named for when Free Republic was telling all of its people, it's a big, huge conservative website, telling all of its people, members, to go find these things and vote on them. So it makes it look like their candidate won. But it says right there, disclaimer, not scientific at all. Don't rely on this, right? It's just for fun. And so that's the vote, the ones he was talking about. The only poll I'm aware of, only Snap poll, and Snap polls are also of questionable science, but CNN had one that had before, the same group before thought that Trump, and it was 50% of them thought that Trump would do better, 50% of them thought that Harris would do better. After the debate, 63% of them said that Harris did better, and 37%, of course. Well, I'm not sure what the numbers are, because there were probably some that said neither or tied or whatever. But that's how it went down. Um, there just isn't a lot of any good news. Is this as disastrous for him as Biden's? No, not by any measure. Will this even move the needle more? maybe a little bit, but we're down to the point where we're probably at 5% undecided in the key races. And so and Saturday Night Live some years back had a skit about undecided voters, where they're trying to interview a guy and they're in a restaurant and he takes 2 hours to order, for the menu. These are people who just, what is it going to take to make up their minds, right? If you're not familiar with them. But maybe they weren't familiar with Harris. There were 30% or something like that in polls saying that she they wanted to know more about her. Only 9% wanted that of Trump. And that is good news for her because that shows that she can actually grow into it. And so but will this affect it? It's you can't say that it won't have any positive effect for her. She's going to get something. It might not be all that noticeable. Just like the Democratic convention wasn't all that noticeable because most of the change had already happened. And so it's really coming down to those who want to know that they can vote for her. There is a lot of sexism and racism out there, right? Can they picture a woman of color being president and actually vote for her? Well, I think most of them who say no probably have already made up their mind, but but these are questions. And so I'm going to let you flip to you and let you say where you think this is going to go. Of course, we don't know. The social scientists can make all kinds of predictions about this, but we won't know until a week from now whether or not this significantly affected the polls.
So yeah, I'll pick up where you left off and say
Yeah.
that, in the next segment, we're going to talk about the race more in a broader context. For now, we're talking about the debate, the impact of the debate. And so you mentioned the CNN instant poll, the fact that
Yes.
there was a 26-point margin, 63 to 37. I think there's a little bit of context there. But I'll pivot back to some
Sure.
specifics in a minute about the debate itself. But just in terms of like a longitudinal look at those CNN instant polls, they've been doing this for all the debates for the last few presidencies. So what one of the things that is evident is, for example, when Trump won over Biden in the last debate, handily because of Biden's performance, that was a 34-point spread. So it was more. When Romney beat Obama in 2012, that was a 35-point spread, the most in history.
Yeah.
Romney was widely, perceived to have really taken it to Obama. He was ill prepared for that debate.
Yeah.
But on average, it's going to be about an 18-point spread. So again, people say, who cares about this specific thing? But just in terms of over time, it appeared to many people who may potentially look through the prism of favoring Harris that it was like a massacre. And if it looks, from the prism of the people that support Trump, it was the fix was in, and the moderators just undermined him at every turn. He was on the back foot, and he held his own. He did himself a solid, maybe. Like I could see that having been the case. So when you take this all into context, like you said, only 5% of people out there are undecided. The big takeaway here, I think, is that we will see, depending on how far into the future we get, how those 5% shake out. And did any of Trump's supporters say, you know what, maybe I've been wrong? And in fact, because he's only got about a solid third of the Republican Party that are considered like MAGA Nation.
Right.
Another 2 out of 3 are like looking for permission possibly to follow maybe some other Republicans. But the idea here is that he, is it something that's going to move the needle significantly at the national level? It's probably no. It's typically going to move, a point, maybe 2. Now, in this case, we'll talk more about it, but the idea is that it's temporary. It's typically temporary. But then the debate outcome affects the news cycle. And the news cycle begins to affect people's perceptions more. And then that's nationally. And then it goes to the state level. And then those battleground states end up being, having much more influence in this feedback loop. So from a polling perspective, from an impact perspective, the jury is still out. But of course, the performance was all all accounts very solid. Solid for Harris. She did what she
Yeah,
needed to do. So I don't know.
she
I'll give
did.
it back to you. I'll give it back to you. I mean, I think that it's enough to be that 2% that's going to swing the overall balance in her favor, from the model forecasting, etc. But I think some of the specifics are what there's more traction will come from, the actual flaws of Trump or the actual successes of Harris in the
Yeah.
debate.
She actually prepared a good response to the abortion question. I mean, that's where she came on. She was kind of nervous for a little bit, but once that came up, I mean, she was just talking, turned it personal. He was talking about how they brought it back to the states. That's what everybody wanted. It's obviously not true. But I want to talk real quickly about the moderators before we go into the next segment. I saw them fact check him twice. Didn't fact check her at all, so that's considered a bias. But the fact checks were whether or not Haitian immigrants were eating pets, and what was the other one? I mean, they didn't fact check him on there are millions of people dying in Ukraine and a bunch of other things. But they could have fact checked her on a few things too. But they had, under the rules that they'd agreed to, they were allowed to do a quick fact check of certain things. Oh, the other one was, yeah, there are no states that allow you to abort, quote unquote, a baby after they've been born. There's no states that allow for that execution. They wanted to clarify that. But I'm sorry, he told at least two lies every response, if not more. If they really wanted to fact check him, then they can do that. They could have done that. Again, there's always there's always some complaints about that in these things, and there's always a complaint that that candidates aren't getting enough into their policy details. Debates are no candidate ever gets deep into policy details when in the debates. They'll do it in a different forum. This is about making an impression. So they, the moderators. I mean, I actually thought that they were allowing Trump to roll over them when they were trying to ask a question, and he said, "No, I need to respond to that," and he kept doing it, and then Harris did it once, and they turned off her microphone. If there was a bias, it was that way. And I'm wondering, did they do that because, it's okay if men interrupt? I mean, I was seriously thinking that way. But and other people noticed that too, particularly women. Just really want to really quickly before I turn it back over to you, the one of the things that happened in the first half hour of the debate is that Harris started to get a lot of small donations, tons of them, and 71% of them were women that posted on Politico. But there's a whole a bunch of things that went on. People screaming about the pet thing because that is the big one.
The goals are the same for all Americans.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
Governor Reagan, as a matter of fact, began his political career campaigning around this nation against Medicare.
There you go again.
And I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
If Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life.
Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
You mentioned that there were, from your perspective, just a very small number of fact checks. But I was watching the Fox response afterwards, and there was a concerted consensus that it was a 3 versus 1 debate. And that it was it was that the ABC was not neutral, that the moderators had their thumb on the scale, and that they continuously pressed Trump for follow-up when they would ask him a pointed question that it was a very painful precise question that he avoids at all costs. And so when he didn't mention it at all, they would challenge him and say, "You were the president. You did this. September, January 6th.
Right.
You know, what do please revisit this question." And then so he was forced in a very uncomfortable way to, even though he just tiptoed around it for 2 minutes, he kind of had to go back and come up with some other thing. And typically he would project an attack and just deny. And not to oversimplify, but that's the pattern I think that the Republican people were responding to, is that he really was up against the ropes quite a bit.
And they didn't fact check her when she made the universally everybody's thinks is out of context. In fact, I know a lot of my fellow people on the left do it, but the good people on both sides, the media and the left, have taken that out of context. It was sloppy wording on his part, so he kind of deserves it, but he really wasn't saying that the Tiki Torch people who were saying Jews will not replace us were good, fine people. They could have fact checked her on that, but they didn't.
So I think part of the issue to me that when I referenced earlier that what we saw was a performance by Harris where she was able to manipulate Trump into saying certain things. And so I heard one commentator, say that his brain was hacked in a predictable way. She was able to use triggers of everything that, many things that she knew were important to him, that have bothered him. And then she was able to, predictably, in a way where, like, if it was a topic that a weakness of hers, like immigration, for example, the border, an area where she herself was perceived as weak, she was able to follow up with a trigger about him. And then he was spinning himself in circles. Basically, that formula worked every time, all night.
Did his people not prepare him for the possibility that she's going to make fun of the crowd size thing? I mean, that was a big theme for Obama, right? At the DNC. Did they not prepare him? Or maybe they did prepare him, but he just has no impulse control. And that's what she wanted to lay out.
Exactly right. She was able to trigger an emotional response and then call him out and like attack his alpha male status and say like people don't like you, people don't respect you, ...
Yeah.
She was saying harmful things from the perspective of world leaders, and immediately he got angry and said, "Hey, Viktor Orban, who's that strong man from Hungary,
Great guy.
he hates you," and he like pointed at her and he was like, "He hates you." And once you start using hate, it's emotional. It's like she could check the box that she was able to control what he was thinking about.
He also said Biden hates her, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, but go on. So
I'm just using that as an example of really, like, she was able to say, I don't have the exact quote memorized, but in effect, what she was saying is, this is troubling and America deserves better. The fact that he can't control what he says and does, as you can see, is a problem, and America deserves better. And so for people that are her fans already, or people who were, have an open mind at all, they caught it. They could catch up. They could, that they could internalize that lesson. But I think honestly, half the country absolutely didn't see it and instead thought, "What is her? She is out of step, or she's out of off base, or in some way." But on issue after issue, she was able to say, like, or point out, like, look, Trump didn't say would he veto a national abortion ban. Instead, she, like you said, she used that great example. And with Ukraine, she said, like, he won't say if he wants Ukraine to win the war. Instead, his answer is going to be, well, look at, poor Russia and how many people that died. Look at, we really need peace. We really need to just end this, which would lock in the victory for Russia. So in a way, she was in both a subliminal, but also in an overt and a more nuanced way, able to, like, signal what her policy was without stating it. identify a difference between the two of them, and also show how he might be, out of the mainstream, at least for the Washington consensus and the sort of, elite media consensus and the people that really pay close attention to politics. She hit, all the boxes, but the long-term impact, I think, will be a very minor bump.
I mean, we'll see. We don't know, but I agree. I think it will be there. What it'll do, though, is energize her base. That's what she did last night. People were donating like crazy. Will the bumpy? Yes, Taylor Swift, right out of the gate after the debate was over, endorsed her. That was, I think, that timing was deliberate because it made the news. It underscored that he won the debate. I'm going to kind of give my critique of her performance. It's not much, but there are a couple of opportunities she missed. One was when she was asked that question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? She should have said, look, 4 years ago, they were using meat lockers as mass coffins, and because my opponent mismanaged the pandemic, which is responsible for all of the inflation ultimately. She could have said that. When inflation came up, she could have, the cost of food, she could have said, I was hoping it would come up, that in August there was the biggest drop of food prices in like decades for a single month. I mean, she didn't take advantage of those things. But again, she had a plan and probably wasn't going to vary from it so much, because her plan was, in fact, to take charge of the debate, look like you're in command, give an impression, to completely reverse the impact of the Biden debate, and look presidential and look like you're not going to let a world leader, another leader, roll over you. She was tough last night. And she took him apart, and that's what she needed to do. So there will be more people voting in the registration. We haven't really talked about it. I mean, they keep talking about the polls, the fact that that the polls under predicted Trump both in 2016 and 2020, but by a lesser degree in 2020. And by now, those people who voted in those two elections are fitting into the likely voter models. No discussion of the Dobbs effect, which has impacted every election since it's been there. Why won't it affect this one, especially when you've got a bunch of initiatives on it? Anyway, again, it's like I said, yeah, we might not see huge movement in the polls. We may. I could be wrong about that. You and I could both be wrong about that. We might see a big improvement in the polls, but only time will tell.
I think where it matters most is in obviously those battleground states from the perspective of the national media. But when it comes to people like myself who actually want a more thoughtful and nuanced policy conversation, where we build bridges, we solve problems, we work together, there might be between Harris and Wallace, they might be actually already kind of adding to that conversation by breaking some things down and actually kind of to a certain extent, being able to stand behind them. So here's one example. Trump was asked, hey, you recently, I don't think they mentioned the Lex Friedman podcast, but they said you mentioned that you lost the election by a whisker. Can you just confirm that you really lost? Because you said it last week. And,
right.
And he said, well, I actually meant that sarcastically. Well, it wasn't sarcastic. I listened to that. That was a very thoughtful interview.
And unfortunately, the moderator, I'm forgetting his name, said, I didn't detect any sarcasm in that. Maybe he shouldn't have done that, especially since they weren't fact checking Harris. But I have to say, another reason is they can only fact check so much. He was lying constantly. She didn't say anything major that was a lie, or so you'd have to try. I've mentioned a couple of things, but
so I have one more. I have one more for us. I'm not sure exactly how much time we have, but I'll keep this quick. So he was asked about his health plan. They specifically said, 9 years ago you said that you had a health plan. To replace the Affordable Care Act, and you were working on it, and so now that you're coming back, what's your plan? What's your plan look like? What are some of the details of your plan? However they worded it, and he obviously there's no plan. But he couldn't say like. We want to stick to market principles. We're going to keep things the way they are, but we're going to make things better. Like he didn't say he didn't keep it on the real. Instead, he
Right.
tiptoed around and said, "We have concepts. We're working on concepts." And
Concepts of a plan.
yeah, yeah, which is
Uh,
effectively a non-answer, So
it just gave the Democrats all kinds of meme material right there. That's
yeah,
you're going to hear that phrase, concepts of a plan. And he's only had 8 years, right, to come up with a health care plan. Um,
exactly.
I mean, the Republicans have been promising it for 24 years now, since Obamacare passed, and I think they were saying it was being typed out back in 2010. Man, they need to hire somebody who can type a little faster. I mean, it's just,
Yeah,
they so yeah. I mean, I think what we want to phrase out, and maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the other things, but the Republicans we already talked about a couple of people who agreed that it was a disaster. Chris Christie, who has not endorsed yet, but seems to be supporting Harris, said that he should fire his debate preppers. But Drudge says that was it. Trump's lost. Wall Street Journal, they thought it was a disaster. I mean, it's so will that have an impact? Where it might have an impact is if it demoralizes the non-MAGA Republican base, which is
exactly.
probably about 10% of them, and that could be a big deal. But that won't show up in the polls. We won't know if that happens until election day, most likely. So it's just. But definitely, the energy was there. I mean, Democrats were holding their breath. She had never had a debate of this scale before. She did well against Biden, but did poorly in the debate otherwise in 2020, and she just aced it.
Yeah,
And again, I'm going to pass it back to you, but I want to remind everybody it's typical for the candidates to not actually answer the question, but to say what they want. And I mean, that's always because most people don't have the attention span. As an attorney, I get frustrated. You didn't answer the damn question. But most people aren't paying attention that much. Sarah Palin made the mistake of verbalizing her prep, saying, in her debate, she says, "Oh, I don't have to answer the question," right? I mean, it was just, you're not supposed to let everybody know. And I'm sure her handlers were like gasping when that happened. But we've only got a couple of minutes left on this. There's so much to talk about the state of the race. I would say it's looking better for Harris now. She aced it about as well as you could. I'd give her an A+, maybe 95 points out of 100.
yeah, that's pretty much. I mean, I think there was no flaw to speak of in the sense that, of course, from my perspective, I would love to have heard a lot more about the policies, a lot more about the specifics. This is my positive agenda. These are the things that are important to me across 5 or 10 things. But that's not what this was. This was like there's a lion in Donald Trump. In he's got a superpower of being able to tap in to the discontented and the people who are sick of the establishment, sick of the system. And she is an icon right now as vice president. She's a principal in the system. So it really was like a historic matchup. And when she said something like, "Picture yourself going to a Trump rally now." And she just kind of went into that. You're going to hear about this terrible thing. You're going to hear about that terrible thing. This, conspiracy and that disjointed, ranting. Now realize that many people are going to leave because they're bored and disinterested. Like she dismantled him in a way, almost emasculated. I hate to say that word because it's not
Yeah, I
fully
know.
appropriate, but it was one of those moments where he was revealed as not he's not that lion through and through. A lot of it is like an eminence front, like the Who song, right? Eminence front is a put on. All eminence front is a put on unless you're a dictator. Well, he's like, he's exhibited signs of wanting to be authoritarian in his leadership style, and not just style, but more than that. So this was a really important event in our history, a very unconventional event, and we'll see even a marginal impact will have an impact probably.
All right, real quick before we go to the next topic, just yes or no, will there be a second debate?
No.
No, I don't think so either. Unless there is a big movement in the polls, then he has nothing to lose.
American 11, are you trying to call?
The cockpit is not answering their phone. Our number 1 has been staffed, and our 5 has been staffed.
I am going to call from Washington. I am in a situation with American 11, a possible hijack.
What's going on, Betty? The crap is erratic again. Problems very erratic.
The plane just
What?
the 737.
What?
Like the World Trade
Who are you
Center.
talking to?
Oh, God. Oh, my God.
United 175, New York. We have some problems over here right now. We might have a hijack over here, 2 of them.
Jules, this is Ryan. Lives on an airplane that's been hijacked. If things don't go well, and it's not looking good, I just want you to know I absolutely love you. I want you to do good. Go have a good time. Same to my parents and everybody. And I just totally love you, and I'll see you later, Chester. Bye, babe.
So today is September 11th. 23 years ago, there was an attack on the United States by Al-Qaeda, resulting in nearly 3,000 deaths, the destruction of 2 iconic buildings in New York City, and also damage to the Pentagon. This changed American politics. All of a sudden, things that had not been possible before were made possible. The Patriot Act, which had been, there's no way it got written in 2 days. This has been a wish list, probably some part of Project 2025 or some equivalent for years. And they trotted it out, and there was not much opposition to it. And we have a whole different life when we go to airports now. A number of people switched politics at that point, or at least became more conservative than they were before. Some actors, Dennis Miller, and the rest. Although I don't know how liberal he was before. Anyway, that's it's if he was reading lines that were written when he was on Saturday Night Live, we don't know what he actually thought. But it did have a big impact on American politics. We are accepting a little bit, or at least for a while, we're accepting a little bit more of a detriment to our civil liberties in order to feel safe. There was a backlash. There have been backlashes against Arabs, Americans, and foreigners. There's been, it's had a huge impact on our psyche and our political, the way we look at politics, the way we look at our role. We started 2 wars after that, Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with it. But we did invade Afghanistan. We were there for over 2 decades before we gave that up. That was another point that Trump probably should have been hitting more on last night, although it didn't have much to do with Harris. America became a bit more hawkish after that. Hasn't lasted. There is a resurgence of isolationism on the right. And on the left, we have a real strong kind of anti-Islamophobic and pro-Palestinian movement, maybe not realistic in terms of policies, but protests across the country. But is there a pushback to maybe water down at least the Patriot Act and some of those kind of draconian elements that now the right doesn't believe in the FBI. They think they're horrible. So do they really want the FBI to have this much power? It's really tricky as to how 9/11 has affected politics. There were ceremonies this morning. Trump showed up, got heckled by a woman, said, "Why is this the first time you've been here?" I don't know that it's the first time he was, but how has 9/11 permanently or in the long term affected politics, and how has it maybe maybe we've kind of moved through some of the worst or some of the more stronger aspects of it.
So thank you for that setup. As always, I appreciate it, but in this case, I definitely do, because it's, this was a national trauma that, in my lifetime, it was unprecedented, and it really affected the political culture forever, including through today. The United States has always been involved in U.S. overseas, mischief. Often that was because of economic or political interests, but this was extremely different. Almost in the like Pearl Harbor is considered different because the war was taken to our shore, and to be honest, we as a country rallied behind the flag in a way that allowed so much more than a direct targeting of the root cause. Instead, our leaders from both parties, in a nonpartisan way, decided to embark on a transformative agenda, and that is deeply rooted now in both our domestic policy and our foreign policy. We have a global war that's continued since then. And there's lots of implications, lots of knock-on effects. But I think you were saying, like, let's be a little bit more nuanced here. What specifically are we still carrying around with us on this? And I think it's the criticism. I think that as people in our country became aware of how that door was opened for increased both foreign and domestic entanglements in our lives that potentially go or overtly go against our values. And so depending on whether you consider yourself on the right or the left, the fact that we chose to target Iraq opened us up to criticism both internally and externally forever. The way we conducted that war. Then when we pivot, and we could talk about that, but I don't think we need to. There's a lot of awful things that happen, and the criticism probably accurate. If you're critical of the Iraq War, it's probably accurate. And I've talked to many soldiers in my life, officers and enlisted men, about every war that I ever learned about. And people are complicated. People have different opinions about things. But I've never heard anyone defend the Iraq War other than to say, hey, we hired Saddam Hussein to be one of our, sort of evil allies, and we paid him, and we armed him, and the people who did that felt the need to rein him in. That's the only positive thing I've ever heard about Cheney, Wolfowitz, the agenda to go into Iraq, and I'll leave it at that. But Afghanistan, I think, is a more telling lesson because it's been called an endless war. And right now, the Republicans, and I'll hand it over soon, but I just want to talk to this just one point. Republicans are speak to the messy withdrawal. And the fact that 13 soldiers died in that attack, between the city and the airport, at the airport, that whole mess of a bomb that went off there, awful. Nobody wants any soldiers to die ever. But 250,000 people from Pakistan and Afghanistan died while we were there. whatever the number is, 2,300 U.S. soldiers died. So these all of those lives matter. All the U.S. soldiers' lives matter, of course. But that withdrawal was a calculated plan by the Trump administration to give up significant gains that the United States made in each region of that country, slowly but surely. Our presence there was orchestrated. The ending was lame. The ending was awful. But we spent $2 trillion there over 20 years. We left behind nearly $100 billion of bases and equipment. We spent $300 million a day there for 20 years. And so the legacy is, again, $300 million a day for 20 years. That's a lot of money. The legacy there is that 4 administrations were focused on counterterrorism, not a higher priority, consistent with our values about how to empower safety, stability, security in that region. So that's a little bit of hubris. I think that's a legacy, that hubris. And we could talk about some of the internal things that were the impact of the Patriot Act, the domestic spying, Edward Snowden and Julian Assange revelations. There's a lot of things that are global reputational risk. We could keep going, but I'll hand it off to you.
Right. We also have the conspiracy theories around 9/11. I mean, the term truther being, used, and Trump in the campaign has pledged to release all of the records, about it. There was a really kind of like with the assassination of Kennedy, a real bad report that was done. I mean, it wasn't just a whitewash. Again, my theory is, as we said on our friend Nick Florey's show, is that when they're covering up, they're not necessarily covering up something any more than their incompetence. Their incompetence for letting Kennedy get killed. Their incompetence for not listening to the chatter, the intelligence chatter that this big event was going to happen on 9/11, to a certain degree, I think that these committees are set up to say we don't want to have America lose faith in its government or anything like that too badly. I mean, and so they did. I think anyway, we could get into that, but it is now created. Now we have the term truther all of a sudden came. Now we have birther, for instance, about the conspiracy theories around where Obama was born, and so we have more. I think a stronger element on the left. The Pacifica Radio Network has actually been impacted by that increase in the conspiracy. The New York chapter, there's like 5 Pacifica stations. I think I'm forgetting what it is in New York, but they almost went under because the truthers had completely taken over that one. In Berkeley, where KPFA is, they basically, the leadership there decided there's going to be no truth or discussion on this. So if you start getting into the conspiracy theories, you're cut off on the phone. If you're a caller, we're not going to invite any guests to talk about this. This is ridiculous. Even because they got to the point where they're even accusing Democracy Now! People of being part of the conspiracy, right? I mean, and we have quite a few from around here. So that element, it's expanded the conspiracy base. It used to be kind of relegated to a segment of the bookstores. Now you've got like whole shelves of conspiracy theory stuff. So that's another way that it has affected politics. And of course, nobody supported it's kind of like Vietnam, where everybody supported it. 90% of the people supported the war after the Gulf of Tonkin happened or didn't happen, or happened in a different way than everybody knew. But now everybody says they didn't support the war in Iraq, and sometimes they're called to task on that because a number of people did vote for it, including Biden, by the way. Where I get into why I don't think that there's a conspiracy behind 9/11, I know I get a lot of flack for this, is that would have been really intricate to pull off in front of the world's media with no leaks and nothing falling apart. But in the meantime, they couldn't plant weapons of mass destruction anywhere in Iraq when they invaded it. That would have been a much simpler task, and they couldn't pull that off. They kept saying that we know they're there, and we know that they had been there, but they every time was a dud. They realized that the materials were for something else or was benign, and so that has affected the politics. But the strange thing is it has led to a resurgence of the isolationist movement of the conservatives, reminiscent of the 1930s. And I do think that that's actually a long-term effect of 9/11. Right? Let's just take care of our own stuff and not get involved out there. Terms like blowback, supporting the Afghani rebels against the Soviet Union. Some of them would become part of Al Qaeda, including the leader. I mean, there's just so many different ways we can go in the limited time that we have. But yes, it is a permanent legacy. Anybody who was alive, it's one of those things that they remember where they were when they first heard about it. And we lost a lot of people.
Yeah, like I said, I think the event itself was traumatic and enduring, and it's one of those things that's not really comfortable to talk about, in part because what you said, you alluded to the fact that people just have questions and they don't trust that they'll get answers. And so, when you talk to people who were Tea Partiers, people on the right, you talk to people who, the far left, people who are suspicious of U.S. entanglements in the name of empire and economic global control. They have one thing in common, certainly. They have many things in common, actually, these days. But over the since 9/11, they're that theme, that trend that has persisted, that has grown, even, is that the establishment government is really kind of viewed with a little bit of contempt, and it's that they just there's a mistrust, distrust, and almost like a, I know they would do that. I would not put this past them. Like that kind of mentality. Because when you think about it, our values as a country, our post World War II values, the reason we have a United Nations, why, if that's your number one enduring thing, is to prevent harm, why cause so much injury, illness, displacement, widows, orphans, malnutrition, destruction of infrastructure, environmental degradation? That's the legacy of entanglement, and that's what people who are leaders choose when they choose to go into a conflict. That's one thing. But like I said, if you're then going to go and pass the Patriot Act, which I'll just mention this, I forgot to mention it earlier when you first brought it up. If you read it, it was a wish list of prosecutors. I mean, it refers to specific rules, and it says, in this section, change this punctuation in this way, change these words in that way. So like may to shall, which means, like, sometimes you can do this terrible thing, and it's like, no, do that terrible thing. And that's in the name of law enforcement. So domestic spying, all these things, people don't trust that the government isn't just going to do awful things. So that, to me, that's an enduring legacy that needs to be earned back by positive action, positive, things that are consistent with our values, not things like a network of black sites and systematic torture, not things like a legacy of drone assassinations, not might makes right, but actual persuasion, deliberation, and the high road of understanding cause and effect. We don't illustrate that we truly understand cause and effect, and I think that's the biggest casualty.
And specifically with regard to draconian things, I mean, all that they need to do, you talk about shall, all they need to do is have an affidavit stating that it's for national security, and the judge cannot refuse it as long as somebody's willing to put that in under. They don't have to prove it or make a showing of it. That's scary. And that has not changed back.
Eeny, meeny, chili beany, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
This brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
Interestingly, you mentioned at the very last sentence of the first segment was, will there be another debate? Well, that's my prediction. Unfortunately, I could lead. I already told you my thought is no, there won't. But here's a brief why. The Harris team immediately said they'd be happy to have another debate. They were satisfied with their performance. Trump's team also signaled an interest in another debate or two. One of his spokespeople said. Trump himself immediately in the spin room even said she wants a second debate because she lost tonight very badly.
Right.
They immediately call for a second debate because they lost. We'll think about that. But I think that both of those were really spin. Trump, even after he said he won, he then went on to say that, well, the winner doesn't need to have another one. So, maybe we'll think about it. In other words, he's only going to agree to it if he thinks it's necessary. And I would say that chances are that the Harris bump will be marginal, somewhere between 1 and 2 points, meaning there's not enough of an effect to cause panic in the Trump camp, which means my prediction is that this experience was so uncomfortable for former President Trump that he will not want to subject himself to another debate.
I actually think that she was amped up. She had just had her adrenaline rushing. She loved it. She says, "I want another one." I think that's probably what happened and why that went out there, because she was having a great time. That was clear. Joy, if that's the theme, boy, that was certainly her theme. Anyway, real quickly, I'm going to predict there was a poll in Florida. We discussed either last week or the week before whether Texas, Florida, and Ohio could come in play for presidential and Senate races. Well, Ohio's a mixed bag, of course, and probably won't change much. But Florida and Texas, the polls are getting even closer. There was a poll that had Harris down by 2 points in Florida that was released on Monday. And there's a number of factors going on there. DeSantis is losing his popularity. They've got this abortion referendum up that Trump changed his mind about like 4 times in 1 week. And so it is in play. So my prediction is that the Democrats are actually going to have a couple of visits there to basically support, first of all, the Senate candidates, which was, by the way, all red in Texas is being endorsed by Liz Cheney. Yet another very interesting development. And so I believe that you're going to see at least a couple of visits. There's not a whole lot of time left. The Democrats can't afford to spend too much time, but at least enough to force the Republicans to spend like crazy to reinforce their positions. And that's a win for her either way. We'll find out if any of this stuff becomes true, but until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.